welcome to Shadows of Black History. Before we begin, tell us where you are watching from, your city, your country, and the time there right now. If you have not subscribed yet, please subscribe and like this video. It helps our channel grow and keeps these powerful stories alive. Stay with us until the very end because this is a story that shook 2 states, challenged the law of the United States, and forced a nation to confront the brutality of slavery. Relax, remove all distractions, and pay close attention as we begin. In the winter of 1856, along the frozen banks of the Ohio River, a desperate choice would unfold inside a small house in Cincinnati. That choice would shock slaveholders, divide politicians, and ignite fierce debate across America. The woman at the center of it all was Margaret Garner. She was young, but she had already endured years of bondage in Boone County, Kentucky. She worked on the plantation of Archibald Gaines. Her body labored in the fields, but her heart carried the weight of something even heavier, the constant fear that her children would grow up in chains. Margaret was not born with freedom in sight. She was born into slavery. Her mother had been enslaved. Her children were enslaved by law the moment they were born. In Kentucky, just across the river from free Ohio, the line between bondage and freedom was measured in cold water and thin ice. For many enslaved families, the Ohio River symbolized possibility. On one side stood plantations and whips. On the other side stood hope, though fragile and uncertain. In late January of 1856, heavy snow fell across the region. The river froze in sections. It was dangerous, but it also created opportunity. Margaret and her husband Robert decided they could not wait any longer. They gathered their children. Quietly, under the cover of winter darkness, they crossed the frozen river into Ohio. The journey was terrifying. Ice cracked beneath their feet. Wind cut through thin clothing. But they made it across. They believed they had reached freedom. They took shelter in the home of relatives in Cincinnati. For a brief moment, it seemed that their gamble had succeeded. But the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 was unforgiving. It allowed slave catchers to pursue escaped slaves even into free states. Federal marshals were quickly alerted. Armed men surrounded the house where Margaret and her family hid. Inside, panic rose like fire. Margaret understood what capture meant. It meant being dragged back to Kentucky. It meant punishment. It meant her children growing up enslaved, facing the same violence and exploitation she had known. She had seen what slavery did to young girls. She had lived it. Reports later suggested that one of her children had been fathered by Archibald Gaines, a painful reminder of how deeply slavery invaded the body and the family. When the marshals forced their way inside, chaos erupted. In that moment, Margaret made a decision that would echo through history. Rather than allow her children to be returned to slavery, she took a knife and killed her young daughter. She attempted to kill her other children as well, but was stopped before she could complete the act. The room fell into stunned silence. Blood stained the floor. The child lay lifeless. Margaret did not deny what she had done. Witnesses later described her as calm, almost resolute. She reportedly said that she would rather see her children dead than return to bondage. In that terrible moment, she believed death was mercy compared to slavery. The legal battle that followed drew national attention. Abolitionists rallied around her, arguing that she should be tried in Ohio for murder rather than returned under the Fugitive Slave Act. If tried in Ohio, she might avoid being sent back into slavery. Slaveholders insisted that property law took priority. The question before the court was not only about one woman. It was about federal authority and the reach of slavery into free states. Crowds gathered outside the courthouse. Newspapers printed daily updates. Politicians watched carefully. The case forced Americans to confront a harsh reality. What kind of system drives a mother to kill her own child to prevent a return to slavery? That question lingered in every report. In the end, the court ruled that Margaret Garner and her family must be returned to Kentucky under the Fugitive Slave Act. The law favored slaveholders. She was taken back across the river, the same river she had crossed seeking freedom. Her surviving children were returned with her. Margaret's story did not end there. While being transported further south by boat, the vessel collided with another ship. Accounts suggest that during the chaos, one of her remaining children drowned. Margaret herself survived, but her life remained marked by tragedy. She later died while still enslaved. Her act divided opinion sharply. Some condemned her as criminal. Others saw her as a mother driven to unimaginable desperation by a cruel system. Abolitionists used her story to expose the moral cost of slavery. They argued that no law could justify a structure that forced such a choice. The case of Margaret Garner inspired later works of literature and continues to be studied by historians. It remains one of the most haunting examples of resistance shaped by maternal love and desperation. Her action was not an organized uprising like that of Charles Deslands. It was deeply personal. It was intimate. It unfolded within the walls of a single room. Yet its impact spread across the nation. As you sit with this story, consider the weight of her decision. Imagine the fear of hearing armed men break down a door. Imagine knowing the law would send you back to bondage. Imagine believing that death was the only protection left for your child. This is not an easy story. It is not meant to be comfortable. It is meant to reveal the brutal logic of slavery. Margaret Garner did not lead a march. She did not organize hundreds. But her act forced America to confront the human cost of its laws. Her story remains in the shadows of Black history, not because it is small, but because it is painful. It reminds us that slavery was not just chains and labor. It was the breaking of families, the invasion of motherhood, and the destruction of choice. Tell us where you are watching from and what time it is there right now. If this story moved you, subscribe and like so we can continue bringing powerful, hidden histories into the light. Stay thoughtful. Stay aware. And remember that sometimes the most powerful resistance is born from the deepest love and the most unbearable pain. When Margaret Garner was forced back across the frozen Ohio River in the winter of 1856, the moment felt like more than personal defeat. It felt like proof that even free soil could not fully shield a black body from the reach of slavery. The same river that had symbolized hope now seemed like a cruel line that offered promise without protection. On one side stood the idea of liberty. On the other stood ownership. And in between, a mother had made a choice that would forever stain the conscience of a nation. As she was transported back to Kentucky under guard, Margaret did not cry publicly. Witnesses described her as composed, almost detached. Some interpreted her silence as shock. Others believed it was resolve. What we know is that she had crossed a moral boundary that few could imagine. In her mind, slavery was worse than death. That belief did not come from imagination. It came from experience. She had lived under a system where her body was not her own. Where her children could be sold without warning. Where violence was law. The legal battle that unfolded in Cincinnati had drawn national attention, but once the court ruled in favor of the slaveholder, the headlines slowly shifted elsewhere. Yet the impact did not fade. Abolitionists carried her story into speeches across the North. They described her not as a monster, but as a mother driven beyond the limits of endurance. They asked audiences to confront the question that would not go away. What kind of society forces a woman to believe that killing her child is an act of mercy? In Kentucky, Margaret returned to the plantation world she had tried to escape. But she did not return unchanged. She was now known. Her name had traveled across newspapers. Her act had become political. Archibald Gaines regained control over what he considered property, but he could not control the story that followed her. The plantation that once held her quietly now held a woman whose decision had sparked debate in cities far beyond Boone County. The tragedy did not end upon her return. While being transported further south later that year, the steamboat carrying Margaret and others collided with another vessel on the Ohio River. Chaos erupted. Accounts suggest that one of her surviving children was thrown overboard and drowned. The river that had once offered escape now claimed another life. Margaret survived the collision, but survival did not mean safety. She remained enslaved. Years later, during the Civil War, her story resurfaced once more. As the nation tore itself apart over slavery, the memory of Margaret Garner lingered in speeches and writings. Some saw her as evidence that slavery corrupted motherhood itself. Others saw her act as tragic proof of desperation. In the North, abolitionist writers used her story to illustrate that the Fugitive Slave Act extended cruelty even into free states. Her case became part of a larger moral argument that slavery was incompatible with the principles of liberty the United States claimed to uphold. It is important to understand the emotional world Margaret inhabited. She had likely endured sexual exploitation under slavery. Reports at the time suggested that one of her children may have been fathered by her enslaver. This reality was common on plantations, yet rarely spoken of openly. Enslaved women lived under constant threat of assault. Their children carried the visible evidence of that violation. For Margaret, the thought of her daughter growing up under the same system may have been unbearable. Her act, though horrifying, emerged from that context. The question of justice remained complicated. Some argued she should have been tried in Ohio for murder. Others insisted property law overruled state jurisdiction. The decision to return her to Kentucky under federal authority reinforced the dominance of slaveholding interests at that time. It showed how deeply the legal system was intertwined with slavery. Even in a free state, a black woman's body could be claimed as property. After the Civil War and emancipation in 1865, the story of Margaret Garner entered a new phase. No longer a fugitive slave, she became part of a historical memory shaping how Americans understood the cost of bondage. Writers and historians revisited her case as an example of maternal resistance. Her name appeared in discussions about the psychological violence of slavery. Unlike armed revolts led by men marching with weapons, her resistance was rooted in motherhood. It was intimate and devastating. Her legacy challenges us to think about resistance in broader terms. Not all resistance looks like organized uprising. Sometimes it takes place inside a single room, under unbearable pressure. Sometimes it is a decision made in seconds that echoes for generations. Margaret Garner's act forced America to confront the cruelty embedded within its laws. It forced observers to recognize that slavery did not merely control labor. It invaded family bonds and personal identity. Even today, scholars debate how to interpret her action. Some focus on agency, arguing that she seized control in a situation designed to deny her any control. Others emphasize the tragedy and the cost. Both perspectives reveal the depth of the story. It cannot be simplified into heroism or villainy. It stands as a stark reminder of how extreme oppression can push human beings to unimaginable choices. If we place her story beside others from this era, a pattern emerges. Enslaved people resisted in many forms. Some ran. Some fought. Some poisoned masters. Some organized revolts. Some turned to the courts. Margaret's act fits within that wider spectrum. It reveals that resistance was not always collective or strategic. Sometimes it was born from immediate terror and fierce love. As we move forward in this journey through shadows of Black history, carry this awareness with you. History is not only battles and laws. It is moments of decision. It is the space between fear and action. It is the courage, or desperation, to choose differently when the world offers no good options. Margaret Garner stood in that space in 1856. Her choice continues to challenge how we understand justice, motherhood, and the true cost of slavery. After Margaret Garner was returned to Kentucky in the year 1856, her physical chains were restored, but something irreversible had already happened. Her name had crossed state lines. Her act had forced judges, politicians, ministers, and ordinary citizens to argue openly about the true nature of slavery. She was no longer invisible. That visibility did not protect her from bondage, but it transformed her into a symbol. Symbols are powerful. They travel farther than the person who created them. Life on the plantation resumed its harsh rhythm. Dawn brought labor. Night brought exhaustion. Overseers enforced discipline without mercy. Yet Margaret's existence carried a quiet tension. Enslavers prefer obedience without question. They prefer submission without memory. Margaret had shattered that illusion. Every time she walked through the fields, she carried a story that slaveholders wished could be erased. The knowledge of what she had done, and why she had done it, lingered in the air. We must imagine what it meant for her to continue living under the authority of the very system she had tried to escape. The child she killed had been her daughter. The surviving children remained enslaved. Grief did not free her from labor. Pain did not reduce her workload. Slavery did not pause for mourning. That is one of its cruelest truths. It demanded productivity even from those drowning in sorrow. News of her case continued to circulate in northern newspapers. Abolitionists referred to her as a tragic figure shaped by brutality. They described her act not as madness, but as a response to a life without legal protection. They reminded audiences that under the law of the time, enslaved mothers had no authority over their children. Children could be sold at any moment. Families could be separated permanently. In that context, Margaret's decision forced Americans to confront a harsh question. If slavery was truly humane, why would a mother believe death was the only escape for her child? Southern newspapers told a different story. They portrayed her as criminal and unstable. They insisted that slavery was not cruel. They argued that abolitionists were exaggerating conditions to inflame public opinion. This clash of narratives revealed how deeply divided the country had become. Margaret's story became a mirror reflecting two opposing visions of America. One side defended property and order. The other side demanded recognition of humanity and moral accountability. In the years leading up to the Civil War, tensions over slavery intensified. The Dred Scott decision in 1857 declared that African Americans could not be citizens and had no rights that white men were bound to respect. That ruling reinforced the very system Margaret had fought against. It suggested that even in free states, black lives were subject to the authority of slaveholding interests. For many abolitionists, the combination of Dred Scott and the Garner case revealed a pattern. The law protected slavery more fiercely than it protected life. Margaret's personal life after her return remains partially hidden in history. Records suggest that she was later sold further south. Enslaved people were often moved like commodities when controversy followed them. Moving her would reduce attention and restore quiet control. During transport by steamboat, tragedy struck again when the vessel collided with another ship. In the confusion, one of her children drowned. The river that once symbolized escape now became the site of another loss. It is difficult to imagine the emotional weight she carried after that event. When the Civil War erupted in 1861, the institution that had shaped her life began to fracture. Battles raged across states. The Mississippi River became a strategic artery for Union forces. Enslaved people fled plantations when armies approached. By the year 1865, slavery was formally abolished. The chains that defined Margaret's life were legally broken. Yet freedom arrived too late to undo the suffering she endured. Her story did not disappear after emancipation. Instead, it entered literature and cultural memory. Writers revisited her case as an example of maternal resistance. Decades later, her story would inspire works of fiction exploring the psychological scars of slavery. Artists and scholars examined her life not to celebrate tragedy, but to understand its roots. They asked how a society could create conditions so severe that a mother would choose death over return to bondage. Margaret Garner's legacy challenges us to expand our understanding of resistance. Resistance is not always organized rebellion with weapons and marching formations. Sometimes it is a refusal to allow a system to define the fate of one's child. Sometimes it is a desperate act shaped by unbearable circumstances. Her decision was shaped by years of exploitation, fear, and the constant threat of family separation. In that sense, her act was not isolated. It was born from the daily violence of slavery. Her story also exposes the intersection of gender and bondage. Enslaved women faced specific vulnerabilities. They endured forced labor and sexual exploitation. They carried children who inherited their enslaved status. Their motherhood was controlled by others. In that reality, protecting one's child could take extreme forms. Margaret's act forces historians to confront how deeply slavery invaded the private sphere of family life. Today, when scholars and students discuss the era before the Civil War, Margaret Garner stands among the most haunting figures. Her life reminds us that the fight against slavery was not abstract. It was deeply personal. It unfolded in kitchens and cabins, in river crossings and courtrooms. It was fought by individuals whose names are not always remembered. If we place her story alongside others from this period, we see a pattern of resistance shaped by circumstance. Some revolted openly. Some escaped quietly. Some used the courts. Some used violence. All were navigating a world that denied them autonomy. Margaret's story remains powerful because it confronts us with uncomfortable truth. Slavery was not merely economic exploitation. It was a system that forced impossible choices upon human beings. As we move deeper into shadows of Black history, let her story settle heavily. Let it challenge easy narratives. Let it remind us that history's most painful chapters demand honest reflection. Margaret Garner did not march at the head of an army. She did not deliver speeches in public squares. Yet her act forced a nation to confront its conscience. In that way, her shadow stretches far beyond the small room where her decision was made. By the time the Civil War began in the year 1861, Margaret Garner's name had already become part of a deeper moral argument unfolding across the United States. The country was no longer simply debating economics or states' rights. It was wrestling with the human cost of slavery. Her story had done something powerful. It had taken the abstract cruelty of bondage and placed it inside a single room, inside a mother's arms, inside a decision that could not be ignored. As war spread across the nation, enslaved people across the South began to move in ways that would have seemed impossible only a few years earlier. Union armies advancing into Confederate territory created cracks in the structure of slavery. Enslaved families fled plantations, seeking protection behind Union lines. Camps for escaped slaves, often called contraband camps, began to form. Word traveled quickly. The same networks of communication that once carried whispers of rebellion now carried news of approaching freedom. Though Margaret's exact movements during the war years remain unclear in historical records, the legal system that once claimed her as property began to crumble. The Emancipation Proclamation of 1863 declared enslaved people in Confederate states free, though enforcement depended on Union military success. By 1865, the 13th Amendment formally abolished slavery in the United States. For millions, including Margaret if she survived until that time, the law finally changed. But emancipation did not erase memory. It did not return lost children. It did not restore years taken by forced labor. For Margaret Garner, if she lived to see freedom, it came after unimaginable suffering. Freedom after trauma carries its own weight. The body may be free, yet the mind holds images that do not fade easily. After the war, during Reconstruction, the nation attempted to redefine citizenship and rights. Black men voted. Schools for freed children were established. Churches became centers of leadership and organizing. In this new atmosphere, stories like Margaret's took on renewed meaning. They were reminders of what had been endured. They were warnings against allowing injustice to return under new names. Yet Reconstruction was short-lived. By the late 19th century, segregation and disenfranchisement took root across the South. Laws known as Jim Crow restricted movement, voting, and economic opportunity. Though slavery had ended, racial control evolved into new forms. The memory of slavery, including stories like Margaret Garner's, remained a quiet undercurrent shaping how communities understood freedom and vulnerability. In the 20th century, as the civil rights movement rose to challenge segregation, historians and writers revisited earlier narratives of resistance. Margaret's story resurfaced in scholarship and literature. Her life became a lens through which scholars examined the psychological damage inflicted by slavery. She was not portrayed simply as a tragic figure. She was seen as someone who acted within extreme constraint, someone who seized agency in a world designed to deny her any. The moral questions surrounding her decision continue to challenge audiences today. Was her act an expression of resistance? Was it despair? Was it both? There is no easy answer. What is clear is that slavery placed her in a position where every option carried pain. Returning to bondage meant exposing her children to exploitation and lifelong captivity. Death, in her mind at that moment, appeared as the only escape. That reality exposes the depth of slavery's cruelty more powerfully than any statistic. Modern historians emphasize that enslaved women experienced a distinct form of oppression. Their reproductive lives were controlled. Their children increased the wealth of slaveholders. Their bodies were sites of both labor and violation. Margaret's act cannot be separated from that context. It was shaped by a system that denied her control over motherhood itself. Today, when visitors stand along the Ohio River and look across from Kentucky to Ohio, they see calm water moving steadily. It is difficult to imagine the tension of that winter crossing in 1856. It is difficult to picture armed marshals breaking into a small house in Cincinnati. Yet that river once symbolized a fragile line between captivity and freedom. Margaret crossed it with hope. She crossed it believing that the ice beneath her feet carried promise. Her story remains in the shadows not because it lacks significance, but because it is painful. It forces confrontation with uncomfortable truths. It reveals that slavery was not a distant political issue. It was intimate. It entered bedrooms and kitchens. It shaped family bonds. It turned love into risk. As we move forward in this journey through shadows of Black history, let Margaret Garner's story stand as a reminder that resistance takes many forms. Some resist with organized revolt. Some resist by running north. Some resist in courtrooms. And some resist in moments of unbearable choice. Each form tells us something about the system they opposed. Margaret's shadow stretches across centuries. It reaches into discussions about motherhood, autonomy, and justice. It challenges us to think deeply about what freedom truly means. It asks us to confront the cost of denying humanity to others. And it reminds us that beneath every law and political debate are real lives shaped by its consequences. Long after the guns of the Civil War fell silent and the chains of slavery were legally broken in the year 1865, the story of Margaret Garner refused to fade. Freedom came on paper first. It came through amendments and proclamations. But freedom in lived experience came slowly, unevenly, and often painfully. For formerly enslaved women like Margaret, emancipation did not erase the past. It did not restore lost years. It did not bring back the child she had buried with her own hands. To understand the lasting impact of her story, we must understand the world that followed slavery. Reconstruction brought hope. Black men voted. Black communities built schools and churches. Families once separated by sale searched for one another across counties and states. Newspapers printed ads from parents looking for children sold years earlier. The desire to rebuild family bonds was urgent and deep. For Margaret, if she survived into this era, that longing would have been sharp. Slavery had denied her control over her children. Emancipation offered the chance, at least in theory, to claim that authority. But the promise of Reconstruction was fragile. White resistance grew quickly. Violence emerged through groups determined to restore racial control. Laws shifted. By the end of the 19th century, segregation hardened across the South. African Americans faced discrimination in schools, employment, housing, and voting. Though chains were gone, inequality remained. In this environment, stories from the era of slavery took on renewed importance. They served as warnings and as testimony. Margaret Garner's act became part of that testimony. Abolitionists had once used her story to argue against the Fugitive Slave Act. After the war, writers and scholars used her story to examine the psychological violence of slavery. They asked how a system could distort motherhood so severely that a woman would choose death over return to bondage. They explored how enslaved women navigated a world where their bodies and children were legally owned by others. Her story also influenced literature. Decades after her death, writers drew inspiration from her life when exploring themes of memory, trauma, and maternal protection. Through fiction and historical analysis, Margaret's decision was revisited not to sensationalize it, but to understand it. Her life became a lens through which to study how deeply slavery invaded the most private spaces of human experience. There is a tendency in history to focus on large events, battles, declarations, and elections. Yet Margaret's story reminds us that some of the most powerful turning points happen in confined spaces. A small room in Cincinnati. A mother holding a child. The sound of boots on stairs. In that compressed moment, national laws and personal fear collided. Her act exposed the moral contradiction at the heart of a country that claimed liberty while enforcing bondage. Modern historians continue to debate how to interpret her decision. Some emphasize her agency. They argue that within a system designed to strip her of all power, she made a choice that asserted control. Others emphasize tragedy. They focus on the loss and the psychological toll. Both interpretations matter. They show that resistance is rarely simple. It is shaped by circumstance, by trauma, by love, and by fear. When we compare Margaret's story with other acts of resistance during slavery, a broader picture emerges. Charles Deslands led hundreds in organized revolt. Denmark V.C. planned an uprising aimed at seizing a city. Sengby P. rose against captors on the open sea. Margaret's resistance unfolded within a family. It was intimate, immediate, and devastating. Each of these stories reflects different strategies against oppression. Together they reveal that enslaved people were never passive. They resisted in ways shaped by their environment and opportunity. Standing today along the Ohio River, one sees peaceful water flowing between Kentucky and Ohio. Boats pass quietly. Bridges stretch across the current. Yet beneath that calm surface lies memory. In 1856, that river was a line between bondage and possibility. Margaret crossed it believing she had reached safety. When marshals forced their way into her refuge, the law crossed that river with them. The Fugitive Slave Act made clear that even free soil could not fully shield a black family from slaveholding power. Her story also forces us to examine the role of law. Courts ruled that she must be returned as property. The same legal system that proclaimed liberty upheld her bondage. That contradiction fueled abolitionist outrage and deepened sectional conflict. Margaret's case did not cause the Civil War by itself, but it became one more piece of evidence that compromise over slavery was failing. As we reach the closing chapter of this powerful journey, it is important to sit with the discomfort her story creates. It is not meant to inspire pride. It is meant to provoke reflection. Slavery was not only chains and forced labor. It was the constant threat of losing one's child. It was the invasion of family life. It was the denial of bodily autonomy. Margaret Garner's life reveals those truths in a way that statistics cannot. Her shadow stretches across American history not because she led an army or passed legislation, but because her decision forced a nation to confront its conscience. She stood in a moment where every option was terrible. She chose what she believed would spare her child from lifelong suffering. That belief speaks volumes about the brutality she had endured. History does not ask us to celebrate her act. It asks us to understand the conditions that produced it. It asks us to recognize how systems of oppression distort human choices. And it asks us to remember that beneath every law and policy are real people navigating impossible circumstances. Margaret Garner's name remains etched into the shadows of Black history. Her story is painful, yet necessary. It reminds us that freedom is not simply the absence of chains. It is the presence of dignity, safety, and control over one's own family. Without those, the word freedom becomes hollow. In remembering her, we remember the countless unnamed mothers who faced similar fears. We remember that resistance can take forms that challenge our understanding. And we acknowledge that the fight for true justice did not begin or end with a single act. It stretches across generations, carried forward by memory, courage, and the refusal to forget. When we step back and look at the full arc of Margaret Garner's life, what becomes clear is not only the tragedy of one moment, but the exposure of a system so violent that it forced love itself into conflict with law. Her act in the winter of 1856 did not occur in isolation. It was the result of years lived under threat. It was shaped by a structure that denied her control over her body, her labor, and her children. To understand her fully, we must look deeper into that structure. Slavery in Kentucky during the 1850s existed at a tense border between North and South. The Ohio River separated slave states from free states, yet the Fugitive Slave Act blurred that boundary. Enslaved people could run, but federal law allowed slave catchers to pursue them across state lines. That meant freedom was fragile. A step onto free soil did not guarantee safety. Margaret and her husband Robert understood this risk. They crossed anyway. That alone was an act of courage. When armed marshals entered the Cincinnati house where the family hid, the law entered with them. That moment revealed how slavery operated not only through private violence on plantations, but through national authority. Judges, marshals, and federal statutes all worked to enforce the system. Margaret was not simply facing a single master. She was facing the machinery of a nation that had legalized ownership of her body. Her decision must be seen against that backdrop. She had witnessed exploitation. Historical reports suggest that she had endured sexual abuse from her enslaver. Enslaved women often lived under constant threat of assault, with no legal protection. Children born from such violence inherited enslaved status. For Margaret, the thought of her daughter growing up under the same system may have felt unbearable. In that confined space, with armed men breaking in, she acted within seconds. Her choice was shaped by years of powerlessness. After her forced return to Kentucky, and later transport further south, the river claimed another of her children during the steamboat collision. Loss followed her even beyond the moment that made her name known. The tragedy compounded itself. The emotional burden of that sequence is difficult to imagine. Yet even in that suffering, her story traveled. It moved beyond the plantation where she had lived. Abolitionists understood the power of narrative. They knew that facts alone did not always change minds, but stories could. Margaret's case provided undeniable evidence that slavery destroyed family bonds. Speakers described her not to glorify violence, but to illustrate desperation. They asked listeners to imagine what kind of system would drive a mother to that edge. In northern churches and meeting halls, her name became shorthand for the moral crisis gripping the country. Southern defenders of slavery responded by hardening their stance. They insisted that discipline was necessary. They claimed that abolitionists exaggerated abuse. Yet the intensity of their defense revealed anxiety. If slavery were as humane as they claimed, why would such stories resonate so strongly? Why would crowds gather outside courtrooms to hear updates? Why would newspapers debate her fate for weeks? As the nation moved toward civil war, stories like Margaret's accumulated. Each case, each escape attempt, each legal battle added pressure to a system already straining under contradiction. By the time war erupted in 1861, compromise had nearly collapsed. The moral and political conflict could no longer be contained. Margaret's story stood among the many examples cited when arguing that slavery was incompatible with liberty. After emancipation, her name faded somewhat from public discussion, overshadowed by the enormity of the war and Reconstruction. Yet it did not disappear. It remained in abolitionist writings and later in historical research. In the 20th century, as scholars revisited slavery through the lens of lived experience, her story regained prominence. Historians began focusing more on the voices and actions of enslaved women. They examined how gender shaped resistance. Margaret's life offered a stark case study. Her act challenges modern audiences because it resists simple interpretation. It is neither easy heroism nor easy condemnation. It is rooted in a world that denied her humanity. In that world, protecting her child from lifelong bondage appeared worth any cost. That does not erase the tragedy. It deepens it. It forces us to see how profoundly slavery twisted ordinary human relationships. When we compare her story with armed uprisings led by men, we see the range of resistance under slavery. Some organized marches. Some plotted revolts. Some attacked overseers. Margaret's resistance unfolded in a domestic space. It centered on motherhood. It reminds us that slavery invaded not only public life but private life. It entered kitchens and bedrooms. It shaped the most intimate bonds. Standing today at the site along the Ohio River where fugitives once crossed, it is possible to imagine the cold wind of that January night. Ice cracking underfoot. Children clutched tightly. Hope rising with each step toward the opposite shore. That crossing was an act of faith. When the law pursued them even there, it revealed the reach of slavery's shadow. Margaret Garner's story remains one of the most haunting in the history of American slavery. It does not offer comfort. It offers confrontation. It asks us to consider how law can uphold injustice. It asks us to examine how systems of power shape individual choices. And it asks us to remember that behind every historical debate are human lives marked by consequence. As we move toward the final chapter of this journey, we carry with us the weight of her decision and the broader truth it reveals. Slavery was not sustained only by chains and whips. It was sustained by laws, by silence, and by a refusal to acknowledge suffering. Margaret Garner shattered that silence. Her shadow stretches across time as a reminder that even in the most confined spaces, acts of defiance can force a nation to look in the mirror. Chapter 7. By the time the United States entered the 20th century, the story of Margaret Garner had already moved beyond the frozen riverbank where her desperate act unfolded. It had traveled through courtrooms, newspapers, abolitionist meetings, and whispered memory. It had survived war, emancipation, and the rise of segregation. Yet even as the country changed, the core question her life raised remained unsettled. What happens to a society that creates conditions so cruel that a mother believes death is the only mercy she can offer her child? Margaret did not leave behind speeches or letters explaining her thoughts. Much of what we know about her comes from court records, newspaper reports, and the writings of observers. That means her voice reaches us filtered through others. Yet even through those layers, the emotional force of her decision remains clear. She stood in a confined room in Cincinnati in the year 1856, surrounded by armed men representing the authority of a nation. In that moment she made a choice that defied the law, but affirmed her belief that her children belonged to her, not to the system claiming ownership. After the Civil War ended slavery in 1865, the legal foundation that had defined her as property was dismantled. But dismantling law does not erase trauma. The legacy of slavery continued to shape lives through poverty, discrimination, and violence. Formerly enslaved families worked to rebuild connections broken by sale and separation. Churches and community networks became spaces of healing and organization. Within those spaces, stories from the era of bondage were preserved, not to reopen wounds, but to ensure memory survived. Margaret's story became part of that preserved memory. It stood as testimony to the extremity of slavery's reach. It demonstrated that bondage was not only about forced labor. It was about control over reproduction, over motherhood, over the future of children. By killing her daughter rather than allowing her to be dragged back into slavery, Margaret exposed how deeply the system invaded the most sacred bond between parent and child. In the decades that followed, historians began examining slavery not only as an economic institution, but as a psychological and social structure. They studied how enslaved women navigated daily threats. They documented patterns of sexual exploitation on plantations. They analyzed how laws treated enslaved children as assets rather than human beings. In that scholarship, Margaret Garner's life became a powerful case study. Her story provided undeniable evidence of the emotional violence embedded within the system. Literature also carried her legacy forward. Writers explored themes of memory, guilt, love, and survival rooted in stories like hers. Through fiction and historical narrative, her experience reached new audiences who might never read court transcripts. In these retellings, the focus often shifted from legal arguments to inner life. What did she feel as she crossed the river? What thoughts raced through her mind when marshals broke down the door? Though we cannot know her exact words, the power of her situation invites reflection. Her story also forces us to reconsider how we define resistance. It is easy to recognize resistance when it takes the form of organized rebellion or armed confrontation. It is more difficult when resistance is intertwined with grief and loss. Margaret's act was not aimed at overthrowing slavery. It was aimed at protecting her child from its grasp. Yet in doing so, she struck at the moral foundation of the institution. She revealed that slavery's cruelty could drive even maternal love into fatal action. In the modern world, her name is often invoked in discussions about autonomy and justice. Scholars debate the ethical dimensions of her decision. Some argue that she exercised agency in a system designed to deny it. Others emphasize the irreversible tragedy of a child's death. Both perspectives highlight the complexity of her life. History does not present us with easy heroes or villains. It presents us with human beings shaped by their environment, making choices under pressure. Standing today on the banks of the Ohio River, one sees calm water reflecting sky and bridge. It is difficult to imagine the winter of 1856, when ice made escape possible yet fragile. It is difficult to picture armed marshals forcing entry into a refuge. But that quiet river once carried both hope and heartbreak. It witnessed a crossing born of courage and a return enforced by law. Margaret Garner's life reminds us that freedom is not simply a legal status. It is the ability to protect one's family, to control one's body, to shape one's future. When those rights are denied, desperation can follow. Her story demands that we confront the full cost of slavery, not only in labor and economics, but in broken families and impossible choices. As we close this chapter in Shadows of Black History, her shadow remains. It does not call for celebration. It calls for remembrance. It calls for honesty about the past and vigilance in the present. It reminds us that behind every historical statute and political debate are human lives shaped by their consequences. Margaret Garner's name endures because it forces reflection. It challenges comfortable distance. It insists that we acknowledge how deeply injustice can wound. And in acknowledging that wound, we gain clearer understanding of why the struggle for true freedom has always required courage, sacrifice, and the refusal to forget.